How and Why the Senate Must Reform the Filibuster, Part 3. This is Ron. Welcome to Storytime. Good morning. It is January 21st, Sunday, and this is part 3 of How and Why the Senate Must Reform the Filibuster. Part 1 was kind of a general introduction about the filibuster in Washington, D.C., and Part 2 was a history of the current state of affairs vis-a-vis the filibuster and how it changed Well, it was 1917 and 1970 that the Senate Majority Leaders made some changes to the filibuster rules that resulted basically in the Senate being almost immobilized and almost unable to pass any legislation. So this is part 3, which is going to explain why this is a problem and propose some solutions. This represents 3 serious dangers to constitutional government. First, the legislative branch cannot function if one house proves unable to act on major legislation, and the atrophy of the legislative branch drives a corresponding hypertrophy of the executive branch. It is perhaps the single greatest reason for the rise of the imperial executive in recent decades. President Obama's constant refrain, "If Congress fails to act, I will," is poisonous to a constitutional republic. But it is inevitable if the legislature wastes away. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the modern Senate filibuster has created one at the heart of our Constitution. Second, because the American people hold the sovereign authority in our country, but delegate sovereign power to their elected representatives, they have every reason to lose faith in their government if their broad sentiments expressed in elections are not translated into law. This is why the belief that my vote doesn't matter, a belief suicidal to a democratic republic, is increasingly heard expressed in our country today. Third, the ability of the minority to cause gridlock in the legislative branch undermines the authority of the Constitution itself. Implicit in the design of Congress is its power to act on most matters by majority vote. Extraordinary majorities are reserved only for extraordinary matters, such as treaties, constitutional amendments, impeachments, expulsions, and veto overrides. The practical effect of the modern filibuster is to replace the constitutional benchmark of majority rule with an artificial threshold of 3/5. A central concept in maintaining the balance of powers is the assumption that the members of each branch of government will jealously and aggressively defend their prerogatives against the others. So why do senators allow their body to be paralyzed? Many argue that the current 60-vote cloture threshold is necessary to prevent one party from running amok, that the requirement for an extraordinary majority assures bipartisanship and compromise. They rightly warn that if legislation is to stand the test of time, it must have a certain degree of bipartisan consensus that the cloture rule facilitates. Yet, when one looks at the Senate today, it's hard to find much collegiality or compromise, both of which require the give and take of good faith deliberation. Nor is compromise possible if the matter to be compromised can't be considered. If the minority can block an initiative by a mere threat to filibuster, it has no incentive to pursue compromise. Republican defenders of the modern filibuster note that the greatest growth of government occurs when Democrats hold both the White House and Congress. The current rules, they argue, are essential brakes for the minority to use at such times. But unfortunately, these rules have proven even more effective at blocking legislation that shrinks government. The result is a ratcheting effect that locks in every government expansion, even those that prove disastrous. One obvious solution to the filibuster is to require a simple majority to close debate, as the House has done for centuries. But this defeats one of the chief purposes of the Senate. A significant minority ought to be heard over the objection of a majority. So how can this purpose be preserved while restoring the Senate's ability to legislate? First, the Senate should get rid of the two-track system that allows it to bypass a filibustered bill and reinstitute the pre-1970 requirement that filibusters hold the floor. The fact that the number of filibusters exploded after the two-track system was introduced speaks for itself. Once the Senate removed all the fuss and bother of the filibusters became common. Yes, this means the Senate would have to deal with a filibuster before moving on to other matters, but it is precisely this inconvenience that made it such a rare event and built pressure on both sides to resolve an impasse. Second, the Senate should restore the parliamentary principle that debate must be germane to the pending piece of legislation. The Senate may pride itself on colorful tales of Huey Long reading Cajun recipes on the Senate floor, but how does this practice fulfill the role of the Senate as a deliberative body? Time on the Senate floor is critical and limited public resource. Tolerating irrelevant speeches squanders the resource and makes a mockery of the Senate. Senate rules already require germane debate during the first 3 hours of a legislative day, but not after that. Go figure. Third, make the motion to proceed undebatable, or at least subject to a majority vote. This incidental motion is itself now subject to filibuster, which prevents the Senate from even getting to actual bills. Great debates should be had on great matters, but not great debates on whether to debate. Fourth, limit senates to 2 speeches on a question. Under current Senate rules, a single senator can make 2 speeches on every motion every legislative day. Fifth, after a certain period of debate has elapsed during which the filibustering can occur, allow a majority to set a limit for individual speeches on a pending question to something like 2 hours. A senator who can't get to the heart of the matter in 2 hours isn't trying very hard. Some senators have argued that the Senate can repair itself within its current rules. The majority leader could decline to sidetrack filibustered bills, force a debate until a minority is exhausted, and hold the Senate in session to avoid resetting the 2-speech per day limit. But experience has shown that in a battle of wills, a determined minority will prevail. The surer course is to restore the original parliamentary principles of debate to Senate rules. There are 2 ways to implement these reforms. One is to follow the precedent established by Senate Democrats in 2013 when they lowered the cloture threshold to a majority for non-Supreme Court presidential nominees. Ignore the rules as they were written, declare a new and fictitious interpretation, and impose that interpretation by overturning the parliamentary ruling of the chair. This, quote, nuclear option, quote, might be effective, but is highly corrosive to the parliamentary procedure required for a full-functioning legislature. Pretending that a rule says something different than it does is a shortcut to anarchy, and I might add, insanity. The other way to invoke what reformers over the years have called the constitutional option, Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, grants each House the power to establish its own rules. Senate tradition holds that, by virtue of its staggered terms, it is a continuing body, and therefore its rules continue in full force from session to session until amended. Those rules require 2/3 vote for cloture on a change to the rules, creating the paradox that the very provision that needs to reform prevents reform. This doctrine of the Senate as a continuing body, however, is belied by the fact that all pending motions at the close of one Congress do not extend into the next. It also runs afoul of the bedrock principle that one Congress may not bind the next. A strong case can be made that until the Senate adopts rules to govern its 2-year session, it is operating solely on precedent. It retains its constitutional authority to adopt new rules by a simple majority vote for the current session, unfettered by hindrances imposed by a previous one. The choice of whether the Senate majority restores its constitutional role in lawmaking is its own to make, to live with, and to answer for. In making that choice, it needs to consider whether its current rules of debate advance or obstruct its role as a deliberative body with the responsibility of passing reasonable laws that comport with the public will. Of historic moments like these, Shakespeare's Brutus said, quote, "There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures, unquote. Voters elected Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, and they expect action. They'll get it from the president and from the House. But in order for the Senate to rise to the occasion, it must reform its rules. And that's the part 3 and the final part of how and why the Senate must reform the filibuster. And it is adapted from a speech delivered on January 11th, 2017 at Hillsdale College's Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship in Washington, D.C., and it is an article in Imprimis, which is a publication of Hillsdale College, Volume 46, Number 1, January 2017 issue. And Tom McClintock has served as a U.S. Representative for California's 4th Congressional District since 2009. He received his B.A. from UCLA, and he's a senior member of the House Natural Resources Committee, where he chairs the Subcommittee on Federal Lands and serves on the House Budget Committee. Prior to his election to Congress, he served for 22 years in the California legislature and ran for governor in California's recall election in 2003. So I think that this was extremely well written, and I think, again, it's an excellent idea. He brings up some excellent ideas because it eliminates the whole take it or leave it approach that many other people have recommended in terms of dealing with the Senate filibuster, which is that either things remain exactly as they are or scrap the filibuster entirely and do everything by a simple majority vote. And I think also he's right when he says that, that having the Senate as a deliberative body and also having the rights of the minority honored so that they can point out obvious flaws or errors in pieces of legislation is excellent. I think that if that had been the case with the Affordable Health Care Act, then perhaps that law would not be under, as a matter of fact, I'm sure that law would not be under assault by Republicans today, because Republicans could have pointed out the obvious flaws, but Democrats at that particular time decided to basically ram it through, not let anybody know what was in the law, and just go with a straight up or down vote. And it ended up passing strictly along party lines. So as far as compromise is concerned, though, I disagree with him in that there's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. that constituents expect compromise, expect their representatives to compromise. And I say no, that's false. That the constituents expect the members to negotiate, but not necessarily compromise. So, and that's a big difference there's a big difference between the two. Negotiate in good faith, but that doesn't mean that you have to compromise your values. So, again, that was how and why the Senate must reform the filibuster. And tomorrow I will be doing another little extra of story time. And until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.